This narrated PowerPoint focuses on technical description as something that might be useful to you as you write your recommendation memo. So here's the assignment. 1, 2, and 3 are options for how you might approach the assignment. You wouldn't want to try to do all 3, of course, in one paper. Below that are the bullet points that we'll talk a little bit. Well, the first one, create a corporate context, we'll talk a little bit more in a few minutes. The second one, you'll need to check the assigned chapter in technical communication for examples. And then I give you the length about what I'm looking for, around 500 words. Okay, so visual aids, they can be fun and interesting to use. You're welcome to use one if you would like to, but you do need to document what you use. As a student, you can make use of materials as a student for your student projects. When you get out in the real world, you have to ask permission before you use somebody's image. There are some that are up for free, for grabs, but when you use something that's pretty specific, like you might need for this recommendation memo, you do need to document where you got it from. And there are some instructions on how to do that according to APA documentation style on the Folio website. You click on resources and then scroll down to links, and the first one under APA documentation is how to document visual aids. And while we're talking about documentation, if you use any type of material from other sources to write this assignment or any other assignment, then you need to be sure to document where you got it from using APA. Okay, so creating a corporate context, what does that mean? Well, as it says there under that it should be evident from the introduction. It should be evident what type of company you work for. You know, is it a construction company? Is it a company that repairs computers? What have you. It should also be very clear why you have written this memo. People on the job are not reading for entertainment. They're reading to get information they often have to act on. So the first sentence needs to get straight to the point, like a newspaper article, and actually newspaper writing is a better model for technical writing than the type of academic writing that you've done in the past, where some of you have done lab reports. A lot of times in high school it may just be a matter of filling out a form, but with the type of writing that you do in the workplace, your first sentence does need to get to the point. You don't have to start out with the universal appeal to all humankind or what have you. Get to the point in the first sentence. The newspaper articles are also known in that first sentence, which is called the lead, for answering the questions who, what, when, where, and why. And you should do that. You should try to do that as well. I don't count off for not having a who, what, when, where, and why, but you do need to get to the point of why you're writing in that first sentence. So here's an example. We'll start following along. And you can see that the first sentence here, the writer has identified a problem. And in the second sentence, he gives a solution to the problem. Now, the rest of this memo that we're going to be following along on is about the three-pronged parts retriever. So, but we're going to also look at different parts and how this applies more to the idea of technical description. One way of approaching description is to think in terms of spatial sequence. So you have inside, outside, front, rear, so forth and so on. Let's say if I gave you a retractable ballpoint pen and asked you to write a description of it, in what sense would you invoke a spatial relationship over the parts? Well, if you're really going to do a really good description, you would probably start with the outside and then go from top to bottom. Maybe start with the button on the top that you push to push the end of the pen out through the bottom. And then if you're going to be really thorough, you go from outside to the inside and maybe write about the little spring and the ink cartridge and all that sort of thing that's on the inside. And again, when you got on the inside, you'd probably go from top to bottom, thinking about how this device works. Okay, so how do these concepts work with this parts retriever that we've started talking about? So here you can see that the writer starts out telling you what it's made out of, and he starts using some very simple metaphors, like referring to it as one of the parts as a plunger. It has some more literal description talking about the prong being a spring-loaded assembly. In the next sentence, he uses another simple metaphor by saying that it's pencil-shaped. When I'm using the term metaphor, that's when writers make comparisons between two things that are unlike but yet share characteristics. For example, if I said, the wind is a hungry lion today, you would probably think that it's a gentle sea breeze. Would you think it's blowing really hard? You'd probably think it was blowing really hard, right? So anyway, this writer's using a very simple metaphor by saying this plunger is pencil-shaped. Then he gives you some literal description that is 4 inches long. He continues with talking about ridges that prevent it from slipping out of the user's hand and so forth, and a finger guard. So here we've gotten into some literal description, and he's gotten into some spatial relationship. He talks about the barrel, and then he works his way up to the finger guard at the top. So it's top to bottom. Though we're also kind of getting an idea of what's going on the inside by saying that it's a spring-loaded prong assembly as well. So of course, in technical communication, we're always thinking about our audience or our readers, and what use that they're going to make with what we've written. And again, as I said earlier, very often technical readers, we talk a lot about technical writers, but there are also technical readers, are going to act upon what you as a technical writer have written. They're going to do something. They're going to follow a set of instructions, or they're going to read something that you've written as a way of identifying something else. It could be a part, or it could be a tool. And one reason we're talking about description is that it will work as well as part of a set of instructions. And here's another example. Here the writer's talking about process, about how this device works. Something else that you should do as you're writing your memos is to use headings liberally. And the purpose that headings have there, as that call out indicates, is that they make the contents of a document available at a glance. Okay? In other words, the reader can just glance at the document and see the major parts of it, what's in it. In this section, we're also talking about the difference between objectivity and subjectivity. All writing is really subjective because you have a human being who's writing it. But we do strive towards objectivity, and so what this writer is doing here is looking at or comparing the retriever to tweezers. And there's a good reason for doing that. It's not mentioned here, but obviously tweezers would probably be a lot less expensive, right, than buying these retrievers. But the writer indicates why this retriever would be better than tweezers, because it can grip, you know. When you're writing a description, in general, it's always a good idea to be definite, as opposed to indefinite. You know, if you need 5 gigs of memory, then don't say enough memory. An inside view is vague. There's a great deal of difference between a cross-sectional view, which is, you know, just kind of like the thing is sliced in half, or an exploded view, which shows how all the parts fit together. There's a good deal of difference between being, you know, with right next to it, between 2 items being parallel or one being perpendicular to the other. So be sure to be specific when you're writing descriptively. Okay, so I call this a tentative outline. It's not, you know, these are things to think about to help you to develop your recommendation memos. Now, it could be that I'll come back and say, well, you needed an overall description here. Or I don't think you were really thinking about your audience when you're using jargon or something like that. So you could see these types of issues come up as comments on your papers. But I'm not sitting here checking these off. Oh, do you have definitions? Could be you don't need any definitions. Could be everything is going to be clear. Could be that you need to develop a little section where you have 3 or 4 definitions. And those, of course, can be quite helpful, or background that your audience needs to understand. So when you get into the actual description of the parts, you want to start thinking about, again, about definitions just in this particular part of the memo. You may have a part that you're describing. You could have a subpart. You know, for example, some of you might be familiar with an oil filter for a car. Okay, if you're going to change the oil in a car, the oil filter is a part that you need, right? What would be an example of a subpart for an oil filter? About the rubber gasket that you have to put a bead of oil around before you screw the filter on. That's an example of a subpart. Not all subparts have to be mentioned or described, just ones that are important to the discussion. So you could, in terms of writing a conclusion, we can usually think about summary to some degree in the final paragraph or paragraphs to this type of a memo. If you're describing an item and it actually does something, you might want to take it through one complete operating cycle. What happens when you press a button? Now, the thing to remember about the conclusion is that it's not called simply a summary. And this assignment helps you to tease out what a conclusion actually is. Now, you've been taught, I'm sure, when writing essays in other classes, in the final paragraph you should summarize what you've already said, which always seemed kind of dumb to me because, you know, does the teacher have a really short attention span or something? Possibly, you know, after hours of grading. But in the conclusion, you know, if, for example, let's say that you went out somewhere and when you came back you noticed that there was a window open at your house that you hadn't left open, and you walked into the house and you noticed that your TV was gone, and your DVD player, you wouldn't just sit around summarizing. You would draw a conclusion and call the police, right? You'd conclude you'd been robbed. Now, the way this works with not just summarizing in the conclusion, actually coming to a conclusion in a recommendation memo, is making a recommendation. And perhaps we could say, in a sense, that's also summary, because the recommendation is based upon the memo that precedes it. That's certainly true to some extent. But the way that a recommendation is different from a summary is that a recommendation is a call to action. Questions? I'll see you online.